They called him Shadow. Not because he moved quietly, though he did, but because darkness seemed to follow him everywhere he went. In the kennels of the Denver Police Department's K-9 unit, his name was whispered with a mixture of respect and fear. Officers who'd worked with dogs for decades would shake their heads when they passed his reinforced enclosure. "That one's different," they'd say. "That one's broken." Shadow sat in the corner of his kennel, muscles coiled tight beneath his black and tan coat. His eyes, once sharp and alert, now held something colder, something that made even the most experienced handlers think twice before approaching. The thick muzzle strapped around his jaw wasn't just a precaution. It was a necessity. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Because what happened next would change everything anyone thought they knew about second chances. It started 3 weeks ago, when Captain Jennifer Morrison received a call she'd been dreading. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Frank Hastings from Fort Carson, about an hour south. "We need to talk about one of our dogs," he'd said. "A Belgian Malinois, military working dog, combat veteran. We don't usually take military transfers," Morrison had replied, already sensing where this conversation was heading. "This one's special," Hastings continued. "And by special, I mean we're out of options." That's how Shadow arrived in Denver. The paperwork told part of his story: 3 tours in Afghanistan, 47 successful missions, 2 commendations for saving soldiers' lives. But paperwork couldn't capture what happened on that last mission, the one that changed him. Staff Sergeant David Chen had been Shadow's handler for 2 years. They'd been inseparable, moving through hostile territory like 2 parts of the same weapon. Chen understood Shadow's signals, could read his body language in complete darkness. They trusted each other with their lives. The IED that killed Chen had been buried deep in a narrow alleyway in Kandahar. Shadow had been ranging ahead, checking for threats, when the blast tore through the afternoon air. The explosion didn't touch Shadow physically, but what it did to him was worse. He'd returned to Chen's body 3 times before soldiers could pull him away. Even then, he'd fought not with aggression, but with desperate, heartbroken determination. Something in Shadow shattered that day. The dog who returned to Fort Carson wasn't the same one who'd left. He attacked 2 handlers, Hastings explained during the transfer briefing. Sent one to the hospital. The other got lucky, just bruising. We tried everything. Different handlers, behavioral specialists, even brought in experts from civilian programs. Nothing worked. Morrison studied the dog through the observation window. Shadow stood rigid in his transport crate, eyes fixed on nothing. So why not put him down? Because every specialist who's evaluated him says the same thing. He's not aggressive. He's grieving. There's a difference. Hastings paused. I served with Chen. Kid was only 24. Before he deployed, he made me promise something. If anything happened to him, I'd make sure Shadow got a chance at a real life. Not a kennel, not a laboratory, a home. And you think we can provide that? Morrison asked. I think you're his last shot. The first week confirmed everyone's worst fears. Shadow wouldn't eat unless officers left his food and disappeared. He wouldn't allow anyone within 10 feet of his kennel. On the 3 occasions handlers needed to move him wearing full protective gear, he'd exploded with such sudden violence that even the most experienced officers stepped back. Officer Marcus Webb, a 15-year K-9 veteran, tried working with Shadow on day 8. He'd used every technique he knew. Calm voice, patient approach, reading body language. Shadow had seemed to tolerate his presence at 8 feet, at 7 feet, at 6, at 5 feet. Shadow lunged so hard against his restraints that the reinforced cable snapped. Webb barely made it through the kennel door. The bite left deep bruising through the protective sleeve. Shadow's muzzle had prevented worse, but the intent was clear. He needs to be put down, Webb said afterward, hands still shaking. I've never seen a dog that far gone. There's nothing left in him but rage. But Morrison couldn't shake Hastings' words. Grieving. Not aggressive. There's a difference. The answer came from an unlikely source. Officer Sarah Martinez had been bringing her 9-year-old daughter Emma to the station twice a week while she finished homework during Sarah's evening shifts. Emma loved animals, especially dogs. She'd grown up around the K9 unit, knew every dog by name, understood which ones liked treats and which preferred toys. Emma was sitting in the break room when she overheard officers talking about Shadow. "Why is everyone scared of him?" she asked her mother that evening. Sarah chose her words carefully. "He's been through something very hard. He lost someone he loved very much. It hurt him so badly that now he doesn't trust anyone." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that would change everything. "Maybe he just needs someone who understands." The next afternoon, against every regulation and better judgment, Emma convinced her mother to let her see Shadow. Not approach him, not interact, just see him. They stood at the observation window, Sarah's hand tight on her daughter's shoulder. Shadow lay in his usual corner, head on his paws, eyes open but unseeing. "He looks sad," Emma whispered. "He is sad, baby. Can I talk to him? Just from here?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. What harm could words do through reinforced glass? Emma pressed close to the window. "Hi, Shadow," she said softly. "My name's Emma. I heard about what happened to you. I heard about your friend." Shadow's ear twitched. Just slightly. "I lost someone too," Emma continued. "My grandpa. He lived with us, and we did everything together. When he died, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I felt like nothing would ever be okay again." Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't known Emma felt that way. Her daughter had seemed to handle her grandfather's death so well. "But my mom told me something," Emma said. "She said the people we love never really leave us. They stay in our hearts. And when we remember them, it's like they're still here." For the first time since arriving in Denver, Shadow lifted his head. His eyes found the window, found the small girl with dark braids and glasses standing on the other side. "Your friend wouldn't want you to be alone forever," Emma said. "I think he'd want you to be happy again, even if it takes a really long time." Shadow stood. Slowly, he walked to the window, not with aggression, with something that looked almost like curiosity. Emma placed her small hand against the glass. "I see you," she whispered. "I see you're hurting." Shadow pressed his nose to the other side, directly opposite her hand. Sarah stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever was happening. In 3 weeks, Shadow hadn't voluntarily approached a human. Now he stood perfectly still, focused entirely on this 9-year-old girl speaking to him through reinforced glass. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Emma asked. "To talk to you again?" Shadow's tail moved. Not a full wag, just a tiny twitch at the tip. But it was movement. It was response. It was the first crack in the wall he'd built around himself. That night, Morrison received an unusual request. Officer Martinez wanted permission for her daughter to visit Shadow regularly. Just to talk. Just to be present. Nothing physical. Nothing dangerous. "This is insane," Morrison said. But she'd watched the security footage. She'd seen what happened at that window. "If anything goes wrong, I'll be there every second," Sarah promised. "But Captain, I've worked with traumatized dogs for 12 years. What I saw today? That wasn't aggression breaking. That was grief, recognizing grief." For the next 2 weeks, Emma came to the station every day after school. She'd sit outside Shadow's kennel, never trying to enter, always maintaining the safe distance, and talk. About her day, about her grandpa, about anything and everything. Shadow listened, at first from his corner, then from the middle of the kennel, then eventually from right beside the reinforced door. "I learned something in school today," Emma said on day 11. "We learned about these birds called albatrosses. They mate for life, and when one dies, the other one gets so sad that it stops singing. It stops flying as much. Sometimes it even stops eating." Shadow's ears were fully forward now, completely focused on her voice. "But you know what else I learned?" Emma continued. "That even those sad birds, after a long time, they start singing again, little by little. It's like their love doesn't die, it just changes into something new. They carry it with them, but they learn to live again." The breakthrough came on day 16. Emma had brought a book, one of her favorites, about a boy and his dog. "I thought maybe you'd like to hear a story," she said. settling into her usual spot outside the kennel. As she read, Shadow did something remarkable. He lay down, positioning himself as close to the door as possible, and rested his head on his paws. His eyes remained open, fixed on Emma, but his body was completely relaxed. No tension, no coiled readiness to attack. Sarah watched from a distance, barely breathing. This was the dog everyone said was too dangerous to save. When Emma finished the story, she closed the book. "Shadow," she said softly, "I think you're ready for the next step. I think you're ready to let someone help you. Not to replace your friend. Nobody could ever do that. But to be here with you. To show you that trust is still possible." Shadow made a sound low and soft, not a growl, almost like a whimper. The next morning, Morrison assembled her most experienced handlers. "We're going to try something," she said, "and if anyone's uncomfortable, speak now." Officer James Chen, no relation to David Chen, though the name coincidence had haunted him since Shadow arrived, stepped forward. He was younger than most K-9 officers, only 26, but he had a gift with difficult dogs. "I'll do it," he said. "But I want the girl there." "Absolutely not," Morrison started. "Captain," James met her eyes. "He trusts her. That's our way in." They set it up carefully. Emma would be in the observation room, speaking to Shadow through the intercom. James would approach slowly, with full protective gear, while Emma talked Shadow through it. "Hey, Shadow." Emma's voice crackled through the speaker. "Remember me? I brought someone I want you to meet. His name is James. He's really nice. He works with dogs every day, and he's helped a lot of them who were scared or sad." James stood 10 feet from Shadow's kennel. The dog was on his feet watching, muscles tense. "James isn't going to hurt you," Emma continued. "Nobody here wants to hurt you. We all just want to help. But Shadow, I need you to try. I need you to be brave. Can you do that for me?" Shadow's eyes moved between James and the speaker mounted on the wall, Emma's voice coming through it. "I'm coming a little closer now, Shadow," James said, his voice calm and steady. "Just one step. That's all." He moved forward. Shadow's lips pulled back slightly, showing teeth. "It's okay to be scared," Emma said. "Being scared doesn't make you bad. It makes you smart. You're protecting yourself. But James isn't your enemy. Look at him, Shadow. Really look." James stopped moving. He simply stood there, hands visible, posture non-threatening. "I know you love David," Emma said softly. "I know losing him broke your heart. But Shadow, he wouldn't want you to stop living. He wouldn't want you to be alone forever. I think if he could talk to you right now, he'd tell you it's okay to trust again. That it's okay to let someone new care about you." Something shifted in Shadow's expression. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "One more step," James murmured. Moving forward, Shadow didn't lunge, didn't growl. He stood his ground, watching, evaluating. "You're so brave," Emma whispered. "You're the bravest dog I've ever known." James reached the kennel door. Slowly, so slowly, he extended his hand through the feeding slot, not trying to touch Shadow. Just offering. "You don't have to come closer," James said. "You're in control here. Whatever you choose, that's okay." For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Shadow stood frozen, his entire body a question mark. Then, with movements that seemed to cost him everything, Shadow took one step forward, then another, until his nose was inches from James's gloved hand. He sniffed. Once. Twice. "Good boy," Emma breathed. "Such a good boy." Shadow pressed his nose against James's palm. The observation room erupted in tears. Morrison found herself gripping Sarah's shoulder, both of them watching this impossible moment. The dog everyone said was too broken to save, reaching out to trust again. Over the next weeks, James worked with Shadow every day. Slowly, carefully, building a relationship based not on commands but on mutual understanding. Shadow would never be a working dog again, the trauma ran too deep for that. But he could learn to live again, to trust again, to be part of a pack again. Emma continued her visits, now sitting inside the kennel with James present, reading to Shadow or just talking. The dog who'd once lunged at anyone who came close now rested his head in her lap, eyes closed, finally at peace. The day Shadow's muzzle came off for good was cause for celebration. Officers gathered in the K9 area, watching as James unstrapped it for the last time. "You ready, boy?" James murmured. Shadow sat perfectly still as the muzzle came away. Then, for the first time in months, he opened his mouth in what looked almost like a smile. His tail wagged, really wagged, full and strong. Emma laughed, pure joy, and Shadow's tail wagged harder. "I knew you could do it," she said, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I knew you were still in there." Shadow leaned into her embrace, and officers swore they saw tears forming in his dark eyes. The final chapter came 6 months later. James had put in the paperwork weeks earlier, but the approval process was lengthy. When Morrison finally called him into her office, she was smiling. "Congratulations," she said, handing over the documents. "Shadow is officially yours." James felt his throat tighten. "Thank you, Captain." "Thank Emma," Morrison replied. "She saved him." That evening, Shadow walked out of the Denver K9 facility for the last time. Not in a transport crate, not muzzled, but on a leash beside James, tail wagging, head high. Emma and Sarah were there to see him off. "You're going to have the best life," Emma told Shadow, kneeling to hug him one more time. "You're going to run and play and be happy. You're going to have a real home." Shadow licked her face, tail wagging so hard his entire back end shook. "Will I get to visit?" Emma asked James. "Are you kidding?" James grinned. "You're visiting every week. This guy would never forgive me if you didn't." As James led Shadow to his truck, the dog paused and looked back. Not at the facility, at Emma. She waved, and his tail wagged again. "Come on, boy," James said gently. "Let's go home." Shadow turned and followed. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because he'd learned something important in those dark months after losing David. That love doesn't end when someone dies. It transforms. It finds new channels. It opens new doors. He'd learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying the memories forward while making room for new ones. It means honoring the past by building a future. Most importantly, he'd learned that sometimes the smallest voices speak the loudest truths. That a 9-year-old girl with glasses and dark braids could see through his armor when trained professionals couldn't. That she'd recognized not a monster, but a soul in pain. Shadow rode in the passenger seat as James drove them home. Through the window, Denver's lights sparkled in the gathering dusk. The mountains rose in the distance, strong and eternal. Tomorrow would bring new routines, new adventures, new reasons to wag his tail. But tonight, as James's hand rested gently on his head, Shadow allowed himself something he hadn't permitted in months. He let go. He released the tight coil of grief and fear and rage that had consumed him. He felt it flow out of him like water, leaving space for something new. Hope, not the naive hope that everything would be perfect, but the hard-won hope that comes from surviving the unsurvivable. The hope that says, "I made it through the darkness. I can make it through anything." At James's house, Shadow's house now, there was a yard and a comfortable bed and toys that had belonged to James's previous K9 partner, a German shepherd who'd retired 5 years ago and passed peacefully in her sleep. Shadow sniffed everything, tail wagging, exploring this new territory that smelled like home. "What do you think, boy?" James asked, watching him. "Think we can make this work?" Shadow returned to James's side and pressed against his leg. Not a command. Not a requirement. Just connection. Just trust. "Yeah," James said, his voice thick. "I think we're going to be okay." That night, Shadow slept in his new bed beside James's own. No muzzle. No restraints. No fear. Just peace. And if he dreamed of David, of missions and sand and a handler who'd loved him, those dreams were gentle now. Bittersweet, but no longer devastating. Because Emma had been right. The people we love never really leave us. They live in our hearts, in our memories, in the lessons they taught us about loyalty and courage and love. David Chen had taught Shadow what it meant to trust, to work as a team, to put yourself on the line for someone else. Those lessons hadn't died with him. They'd just been waiting for the right moment to emerge again. And when they did, when Shadow finally let himself trust again, it was like coming home. Not to the same home, but to a new one, built on the foundation of everything he'd learned, everything he'd survived, everything he'd become. Shadow's story spread through the K9 community. Other departments started implementing new protocols for traumatized dogs. Emma's simple approach, talking to them, acknowledging their pain, giving them time and space to heal, became a model for rehabilitation programs across the country. Morrison wrote a formal commendation for James's personnel file, but she also wrote one for Emma, an unofficial recognition that would be framed and hung in the K9 facility for extraordinary compassion and understanding in the rehabilitation of K9 Shadow. Through patience, empathy, and wisdom beyond her years, she demonstrated that healing begins with being seen. Emma visited every Sunday, bringing books and treats and news from school. Shadow always greeted her the same way, full body wags, gentle kisses, and that soft whimper of joy that said more than words ever could. "How's my brave boy?" she'd ask, and Shadow would lean against her, tail wagging, eyes bright with happiness. James often watched these reunions with a lump in his throat. He'd worked with dozens of dogs over his career, had seen the best and worst of what they could become. But Shadow's transformation was something special, something that reminded him why he'd chosen this work in the first place. Because every soul, human or canine, deserves a second chance. Every heart, no matter how badly broken, has the capacity to heal. It just takes the right person, the right moment, the right words to unlock that possibility. Shadow had found all three in a 9-year-old girl who'd known her own grief and recognized it in him, who'd looked past the growls and the lunges and the warnings to see the truth underneath, who'd refused to give up, even when everyone else had written him off. And in saving him, Emma had proven something else too, that sometimes the people who need healing the most are the ones who heal others. That by reaching out to Shadow, by sharing her own pain and showing him he wasn't alone, she'd completed her own journey through grief. They'd saved each other, girl and dog, both learning the same lesson in their own ways. That love doesn't end, it evolves, and that the capacity to trust again, to hope again, to live fully again, that's the greatest gift we can give ourselves and each other. Shadow's first year with James passed in a blur of joy. Hiking trails in the Rockies, playing fetch in the park, lazy evenings on the couch, all the things a dog should have, the things David would have wanted for him. On the anniversary of David's death, James drove Shadow to a quiet hilltop overlooking Denver. They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "I think about him too, you know," James said softly, his hand on Shadow's head. "I never met him, but I feel like I know him, because I know you. And you're the best of him, Shadow. His loyalty, his courage, his heart, that's all still here. That didn't die." Shadow leaned against him, quiet and steady. The ache was still there, would always be there, but it had transformed into something bearable, something that honored David's memory without being consumed by it. As they drove home, Shadow watched the familiar streets pass by. This was his life now, not the one he'd imagined when he was young and eager, signing up for military service, not the one he'd built with David, perfect and complete until it shattered. But it was a good life, a full life, one worth living. And sometimes when Emma was reading to him, or James was scratching behind his ears, or he was running full speed through mountain meadows with the sun on his back, Shadow felt something that might have been happiness, pure and simple and true. He'd survived, he'd healed, he'd learned to trust again, and if a broken military dog could find his way back from that kind of darkness, then maybe, just maybe, there was hope for anyone, for everyone. Because the lesson Shadow taught wasn't just about dogs or training or rehabilitation. It was about the resilience of the spirit, about the power of compassion to reach even the most wounded souls, about the way a child's innocence can cut through layers of pain to touch the truth underneath. Shadow had been called the beast, the untouchable, the dangerous one, but Emma had seen past all of that to who he really was. A good boy who'd been hurt so badly, he'd forgotten how to be good. She'd reminded him, and in doing so, she'd given him back himself. That was the real miracle. Not that Shadow had learned to trust again, but that he'd rediscovered the best parts of himself, the parts David had loved, the parts that made him worthy of being loved again. And as Shadow curled up in his bed that night, surrounded by the scents and sounds of home, he understood something profound. His story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because second chances aren't about erasing the past. They're about honoring it while building something new. They're about carrying forward the lessons of those we've lost, while opening our hearts to those who stand ready to love us. Shadow had been given that chance. And he'd taken it. Not easily. Not quickly. But completely. He'd learned to live again. To love again. To trust again. And in doing so, he'd become exactly what Emma had always known he could be. Not a beast. Not a weapon. Not broken. Just Shadow. Good boy Shadow. Finally. Blessedly. Home.